My name's Chantel Rush. I am the special assistant to Rip Rapson at the Kresge Foundation. And we wanted to have a session right now before lunch to give everyone a good opportunity to actually ask questions and to actually do a real Q&A with both Michael and Teresa while we have them in the room. So I'll briefly introduce Michael and Teresa again, and I'll point out some other fun people that are in the room who will be able to answer our questions as well. And then we can spend the majority of the time, really there will be a mic runner, and we want to use this time as Q&A, so you can ask your difficult, pointed questions. And what we would ask is only that you would state your name, and so we know who you are, and be potentially concise and pointed. But you know that never happens. Okay, so I have the distinct pleasure of reintroducing Teresa, who, as you know, is a principal at Mass Economics. In addition to all of the wonderful work she spoke about today, she was one of the advisors to the economic development section of the Detroit Future City Plan. She's been a great partner to Kresge as we think about the innovation district in Detroit, so we're pleased to have her here today. And Michael Forsyth, as you know, is at the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation. One of the fun things I realized, besides being a minor celebrity in Detroit for owning the Detroit City Distillery, is that there was a cockamamie idea in Detroit around 2011 that if the city was going to turn the corner, that we needed to utilize talent. There was a lot of talent in Detroit that could be utilized, but also that there were people who'd moved away from Detroit who we might be able to get moved back. And there were also people who had some national outside expertise. And so this concept of the Detroit Revitalization Fellows was born. It was funded by 11 foundations. And Michael actually was one of the first Detroit Revitalization Fellows. And look, 5 years later, he's still...
DRFP for life.
Yeah. So if you're living in a city and you're thinking about a talent strategy, this fellowship program has been really meaningful for us. So, also, we have Pam Lewis, who's hiding in the back, who's the director of the New Economy Initiative. And is Rod here too? Oh, there, Rod Miller. He's like kind of Michael's boss at the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation. So I may also ask them to chip in with answers if anyone has them. And is that Dan Nissenbaum hiding over there too? He knows a thing or two about economic development as well. All right. So I'll ask one question and then we'll open it up for questions more broadly. So I was listening to what sounded like a really elegant solution, Michael, pairing, entrepreneurs with resources, with spaces. But did this idea just come out of nowhere? I'm sure people are wondering how this came to us and how people in other cities can think of similar strategies.
Yeah, I mean, it seems really easy, right? So day one, we heard the government is messy, right? Small business is definitely messy. But, I think the goal is just to try to keep it as simple as possible, not try to be all things to everybody. But, Motor City Match is like a small business. So it actually started with this initiative. I've been at DGC for 5 years. Year one, I just like spinning my wheels, trying to get my head around how to do small business in the neighborhoods with no budget. So we started this program called Revolve, where we basically, we would team up with our local community organizations that knew some property owners with some really good quality vacant space, and we'd put the call out to see who would be interested in doing whatever in the space. Business, art, we had no preconceptions because it was vacant, we didn't know what it was used for. And this kind of competition process was born where we just put the call out and we were like, man, there's a lot of businesses who want to do stuff. And then we'd do this pop-up stuff where we would just try it. And, we'd be cleaning bathrooms at 2 a.m. And, the first coffee shop, we literally started with like $5. Like we had to ask the residents, hey, we need like 4 coffee tables, a bunch of chairs. And then they all came back with all their friends and said, look at this coffee shop I built. There's my coffee table. So it started as this super scrappy, like gritty, sexy but poor sort of thing. Jamie mentioned we got a big Art Place grant, which kind of blew the doors off up on the Avenue of Fashion. So it came from like a proof of concept. So, we didn't tell that whole story, but I think it's important to experiment. Yeah. Right? You try, it's kind of like your startup just got its Series A from, some VC and they made you change the brand. and made it more logical for people to follow. So that's Motor City Match. I think that's kind of the best way to describe it, but I'll keep it at that.
Yeah. So that sounds almost like a bottoms-up kind of business-by-business approach. And then Teresa, by contrast, you introduced this idea that Detroit thought of the economy differently, that instead of building a regional economy and just waiting for it to trickle into Detroit, that they started with the city. And I'm curious, what were the enabling conditions, or why do you think that happened differently in Detroit?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm not sure I know the answer, but I have three guesses. One is RIP, right? One is just someone saw it differently, right? And so, and then kind of the add-on to that, kind of 1B, I guess, is that when you revolve your ideas around land use, I think you just immediately become local, right? And you think, what are we going to do with this land? What are we going to do? And then, for our residents, the third has to be just the glaring disparity between the way that Detroit residents live and the way that people in the suburbs live, right? I mean, Detroit had lots of regional growth for decades, and it had largely not touched the city of Detroit. And so you have to, if you step back and think, well, what would more growth get us? Well, in the past, more growth in the region hasn't gotten you very much. And so, I think, that had to play in it. And then the last one might have been, this region is built around automotives in many ways, real ways. And by the time Rip was thinking about this and Kresge was thinking about this, the GM had moved its headquarters out. The city still has assembly plants, but essentially has none of the tech centers or the suppliers. Very, very few suppliers, none of the tech centers. And so the growth trajectory of the automotives was clearly going to be outside the city. And so I think that when you're when you become kind of a bit player in this region's major cluster, maybe you also think like, okay, this we're a little bit different than the rest of the region.
Almost by necessity.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So we'll open it up to questions from the room. This is really meant to give you an opportunity to ask questions. Nancy?
Thank you, Nicole. Wondering if you have any view on identifying, encouraging, and then supporting social entrepreneurs as a subset of entrepreneurship.
Very good question. So the answer is inherently yes, because almost every small business has a social mission in Detroit. So it's not a direct yes to your question in terms of the traditional definition of a social entrepreneur, but small business, I met with this chef who grew up in Huntington Woods, big-time chef in New York, wants to move back. I said, what do you want to do besides open a restaurant? And he goes, finally, someone has asked me that question because nobody gives a shit about it in New York. They just want to know what's on my menu this spring. And he was just like, that is why I want to do business in Detroit, because I can benefit the community. I have a broader social mission. I can employ people. There's so much that kind of goes with it. So what we try to do is encourage that kind of triple bottom line approach. But we don't traditionally work with, nonprofits that really have a social mission. There is a huge need, though, and I think that's something that we need to figure out, because there is a lot of economic impact that trickles off of that. So I think that's something that economic development traditionally isn't super comfortable with when you talk about like a big redevelopment authority like us. But I think it's something that we should start thinking about to try to quantify the economic impact so we can better justify why it shouldn't just be for-profit, how nonprofit can generate revenue too.
You talked earlier about the 16,000 jobs that were created over a space of time. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what those jobs were, which segments, et cetera. And then secondly, I'm a little struck by, in all of the conversations, the lack of discussion of Dan Gilbert, of the Dan Gilbert effect. And so I say that also because outside the room and outside these circles, if you ask somebody about Detroit, they only know about Dan Gilbert. This is a different conversation. So the pluses and minuses.
Sure. So on the first question, a lot of it has been white-collar jobs in the downtown district, right? I mean, this has been a little bit of the challenge is to kind of get growth more broadly. So you've seen, financial services, technical services, those types of jobs. But you have seen some of the manufacturing come back, right? There are major assembly plants and some serve some of the supply sector for automotives. There's a metals cluster within the city. And so you have seen some growth as well in manufacturing, in retail in the corridors, things like that. And I'm happy to send you the numbers, but I think that the bulk of it is the kind of downtown white-collar office jobs. But certainly, kind of as the national economy, as it came out of the recession, it added certain things first, right? And then layered on some other things. You are seeing a little more broad-based growth in terms of manufacturing and wholesale trade, retail, things like that. On the second one, you're absolutely right on Dan Gilbert, and I should have mentioned Dan Gilbert. I mean, Dan Gilbert's a huge part of that story, right? Like, if every city can do one thing, figure out who your Dan Gilbert is, right? I mean, that's a stunning story. I mean, it's remarkable how much economic activity he brought to the downtown. But it's certainly not just Dan Gilbert, right? And I think one of the things that's interesting about what Dan Gilbert, just kind of watching from afar with Detroit Future City, seeing a little bit more up close, but certainly following it, is it is very much about, rebuilding place and space in the downtown, making those types of investments, and in being in accordance with city government. Like, I loved that he was like, I don't want tax breaks, I want to pay taxes, and I want everyone else who has businesses in Detroit to pay taxes. Like, we need a strong kind of public sector. And so, yeah, Dan Gilbert is, he's just a great addition to the city's economy.
Can I weigh in on this just a little bit? So, some things that we communicate, because I think there's this discourse between neighborhoods versus downtown, which is inherently us versus Gilbert sometimes. So our big statement is be your own Dan Gilbert in your own neighborhood. And, that is the thing that is driving entrepreneurs from around America to move to Detroit, is because they can actually they can buy a building. There is real capital in Detroit. There is this amazing ecosystem of service providers ready to support them. So it's accessible. It's not in New York. It's not in LA. In a lot of other places around the world. So, Dan Gilbert has obviously done great things. Whether or not you feel good about it, it is inspiring. So I think, if you think about what it would be like for many of the sole proprietors to just hire one person, that would generate as much as what Quicken's done. So, I mean, you got to have a balanced workforce approach, right? Small business, one or two folks, times a lot, versus the Dan Gilbert's one person, big number.
Yeah, absolutely. And just kind of an add-on to Michael's point. The problem with an 8-minute talk is what you don't talk about, right? And I didn't talk explicitly about philanthropy because it's a little bit of the backdrop here, and I think most people understand that philanthropy has played a huge role in the revitalization of Detroit. But one of the big bets it has made, both Kresge, but especially NEI, is in creating this incredible, to Michael's point, ecosystem and infrastructure for small businesses. And that was the bet that NEI made early. And they did it in ways that made entrepreneurship really inclusive. And then the Motor City Match numbers are impressive as well. And so when I think about the great story about Detroit, it was this kind of recognition, which was really, in retrospect, brilliant. And honestly, when I heard it, I was like, maybe it'll add some jobs. Fine, it won't hurt. But this focus on entrepreneurship actually ended up being central to not only the city's story, but that it potentially longer term will be a more racially inclusive city in terms of economic power than it's been in the past. And that, so hats off to Kresge, NEI, the people who saw this early and have made really now probably 7 or 8 years of investments in this basic infrastructure.
I know some people are asking who's Dan Gilbert. He's a billionaire who is in the private sector in Detroit. He owns something like 90 buildings downtown, has relocated his headquarters to downtown Detroit. He speaks often about why he did that. And he actually says it was in some ways for his business, that he was afraid that Quicken couldn't maintain the same talent, the same workforce. If it were not located somewhere millennials wanted to live and in a community that they wanted to be engaged. So his belief is that by locating his business in a city, he will have better talent and it'll be a reinforcing cycle.
Ernestine Gary from Invest Atlanta. So my question is for Michael. You know, one of the challenges we have in the city is really providing that kind of embryonic place for businesses to actually get started. And so my question is, does your program provide either space or an opportunity for somebody that has an idea about a business, but they don't have the wherewithal to actually pay the rent? They may not have fully flushed out their business plan, but they really want to be in a co-working space, get some networking, get some technical assistance, and get some support to actually grow it to the point where they can branch out on their own.
Yeah, I mean, not much of it has been said, but Detroit has an amazing ecosystem of business services. If you go online, it's DetroitBizGrid.com. You can see all these things, whether you just have an idea to whether your existing business, what's available to you. For Motor City Match, we were really fortunate where we have 4 really good organizations that do business planning. So instead of us doing it, we just partnered with them. So it was awesome. So now we are helping their bottom line, helping stabilize them because they're all scrapping for grant dollars, usually amongst themselves, to be able to do this for people. So that was a big thing. Being able to support from a city standpoint the organizations that were already doing it. From a space standpoint, we have great co-working space, but that was the whole model behind Revolve. Was if you're a business and you have a great idea, maybe you're making pies out of your house or whatever, and they're delicious and you sell them at Easter Market and it sells really well, you have to be able to try the business lifestyle on for size. What's it like when one person walks in the door on a cold January day and you make $2, right? You have to try that. The great thing about Revolve was you were able to try it before you buy it. So before you sign your life away to a 5-year lease, be able to try it for 90 days or so to see what it was like. So that level of experimentation to let people try it is a really important thing. We've kind of got away from it with Motor City Match, which I think we see that there's a clear gap in the marketplace. But I think my takeaway is, it's a balanced approach, right? Small investments to do proof of concept, even if it fails, will save that entrepreneur thousands upon thousands of dollars in headache down the road. So, if you think about a small business strategy, think about very flexible funds that allow for experimentation live in real time that looks and feels like a real business, right? So I think that's important. And building owners who have had their space vacant for, 3 to 10 years, if you can find them, they're usually game for being creative. If they're a good person. If they're not, they're just not worth working with, frankly.
Okay.
That's bottom line.
Short on time, so I'll go to the question in the back.
Yeah, my question is around the use and leverage of public resources and subsidy. And you mentioned that the block grant was used for TA. And so I wanted to know a little bit about the details in terms of how you use the block grant for TA for your initiatives and whether those block grants were then, or those uses were then leveraged for new markets tax credits on any of your businesses.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about how this whole thing started. It was serious brain damage figuring out how to apply block grant dollars in a way. So, we focused on TA. So, right, you got to meet a national objective. So for us, it's benefiting low to moderate income communities on an area basis or removing slum or blight. So that was the key thing about the goal of filling vacant space was we were able to demonstrate by filling a vacant space in a specific area, if 51% of the community around it is low to moderate income, we can work in that location, right? And then the eligible activities are technical assistance, and really focus on micro enterprises. So that's how we justify the business planning. Helping folks find space is how we justify this kind of area benefit. Once we have a business in a space, now we actually can draw a ring around it based on what type of business it is to see how big the benefit is. That's how we justify architects. But it was important because this money was just sitting on the sideline. Actually was not being spent. This is a first year Detroit Met timeliness. I think maybe ever, which is a huge standpoint. So, this money had never been used this way. We had to work with our HUD field office, but it was great leverage for the foundation community to say, great, you're coming to the table first with all this money to do the most high-risk things, to build the pipeline so that you can use our money responsibly and then further leverage all the CDFI money. All the CDFI money was sitting on the sidelines because we had a bunch of businesses applying to loans that were not ready yet, poor business plans, half-baked financials, no construction documents, and there was still, even if they had it, there would still be a gap on the project. So it was just able to link everything together. And I'm happy to share. Anybody come up and talk to me. We have all our program guidelines, how we did everything with HUD, all that sort of stuff. We'd be happy to share. So consider us a resource on that.
I haven't heard anything on how you have related your economic development programs to the new Workforce Investment Opportunity Act that focuses on how to get underprivileged citizens back into the workforce as well as satisfy business needs. And to some extent, I'm just going to make a comment because it's part of the question. Teresa, that act is focusing on a regional strategy on how a region around a central city can be competitive. How does that fit into your city center strategy versus a regional strategy?
Regional jobs are great. I just don't think it's I think that cities need to have their own job strategies. It's just places like Detroit look like Detroit because regional growth didn't end up in the city. And one of the things we heard yesterday is that, some of these structures benefit people, right? And they're intentional, and it's not, these structures were meant to exclude from economic opportunity. And so I hope, all cities hope their regions grow, and I think they should be cooperative and collaborative on that. This is important because, to your point, I think that one of the other reasons jobs matter so much in the city of Detroit is because of the issues with regional transportation, right? And so I know there was a new Workforce Investment Act. I haven't looked at it. I've heard a little bit about it, but I think that two places this matters, not only for Detroit, but for most cities. One is linking better to regional job centers, right? And so I don't know if the new WIAD, I know it's like WOIA or something, right? Whatever they call it now, but a lot of places, Detroit included, have challenges with linking their LMI communities to the regional job centers. And so I think transportation becomes very important as part of your workforce development strategy. And then kind of taking a page from Detroit Future City, one of the things we intentionally did was to create what we called employment districts. And so these were districts in the city that historically had supported a lot of employment, and we felt, and we knew from the data, could support more employment. But one of the reasons you want to do that is for a city where the transportation is so weak as it is in Detroit, you really want to lower the number of transportation nodes if you can, right? So ideally, you will create these kind of mini job centers within the city so that you can better link neighborhoods to those options. And so I think those are kind of the two big strategies, right? One is thinking about transportation that better links to regional job centers. And the other is thinking about these kind of employment growth patterns to the extent that you can, that link, that provide targets for, where do you put bus service, or if you're going to lay a subway line, that kind of give you better targets for having transportation better link residents and to job opportunities.
Okay, I want to add one really quick thing. So in Mayor Duggan's State of the City address this year, he's taken a really bold stance on the hardest to employ folks. So, like, we have this scrapping culture in Detroit where everybody, scraps copper out of houses, or dealing drugs. These are incredibly entrepreneurial people. And how do we put them to work? And this is what the mayor is really tackling. So, he has been actively meeting with gang members who are drug dealing and say, hey, look, we will give you this job. We're developing these workforce programs. Here is your out. You can take this or we're coming after you, straight up. So it's this dual, crime prevention, but exit strategy for something productive that these folks are already good at. We have to be brave. When we talk about equity, we got to be brave about it, and we got to meet people where they're at. These are very talented people, and they have real skills. You just have to show them a path to how they can apply it to make money that's above ground and legal. And if they can trust you, because that's a big barrier, trust. How do they trust you? If you can prove it, it takes hard work. You got to be in the trenches with them. If you can do it, it can happen, and I think that's how you make more equitable places where people feel like there's an opportunity for us.
We had maybe 5 roundtables around the country leading up to the conference, and one of the things that came up was that the economic development strategy has to be integrated to the land use and spatial planning strategy, which has to be integrated to the community development strategy. And how do these things all work together to create more equitable cities?
Rod Miller, I'm President and CEO of the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation. It can't be overstated, I guess, 2 points that have been hit on. One is this idea of space matters and economic development. And I think in too many communities, this idea of land use planning and economic development aren't integrated in a thoughtful way. So the idea that we recognize that neighborhoods that are on the fringes can either be tipped in one direction or the other, depending on how you leverage small businesses to make strategic investments and establish critical mass. So the reality that neighborhoods that can fall off because there are not services there, you can actually create a sense of place that brings new life and new vitality to those neighborhoods. And so that importance of concentration and coordinating land use planning can't be overstated. The other piece is this work is incredibly messy. So there are more bumps than not, but the end results are progress. So one of the reasons why Motor City Match, Revolve, the D2D program, the Green Grocer, our programs around small business have been successful is because the entrepreneurs feel like our staff is vested in the businesses just as much as they are. So I've gone to numerous openings where people have said, I feel like Michael Forsyth owns this business just as much as I do.
Yeah, so that clean their bathroom. Before they weren't there.
So that's a big piece of it. So that ownership, and then the last point I would say, related to the question that you posed, is from a workforce perspective. The reality is that economies are regional, but when you look at the job opportunities in cities versus the job opportunities in the region, they're vastly different. So our ability to be able to make sure that our economic development strategy, as a city, says this is the population that we serve. Detroit right now is a reverse commute city, so only about 40% of Detroiters own cars, only about 22% of jobs in the region are accessible within an hour and a half public transportation ride. And so when you got the motor city where 40% of the people in the city own cars and most of the jobs that are appropriate for that population are outside of the city, it just doesn't work. So our economic development strategy has to be one that says, how do we really take advantage of trying to create employment districts in the city that will allow people in the city access to jobs in the city? And how do we leverage entrepreneurs and small businesses to show major corporations that they can cut costs and actually lift everyone up around the community, as well as limit the risk that they have of being in neighborhoods versus around things such as crime?
I feel compelled to just kind of mention the fact that the economic development strategy in Detroit is not just limited to small business, and that there is a push toward innovation and entrepreneurship, particularly in the spaces of medical devices and mobility, advanced manufacturing materials, and also the inclusiveness that comes with that. I just didn't want everyone to feel like our only economic development strategy is only in the small business space, because we feel like it has to be in and strategy. It can't be either or. And they both reinforce each other. And so there is a lot going on with that. There's a lot in terms of how do you begin to introduce the youth in Detroit to these types of career paths. And then also, how can you leverage those innovation assets that are in the region and that are very active in downtown, particularly in the digital IT and the med space, in a way that can be more beneficial and more intentional in focusing on the problems of the people that live in the city. So I just wanted to mention that.
One thing that came up a lot in the roundtables was that small business was a necessary strategy, but not sufficient.
Just to it's a great point, both from Rod and Pam, and I think that one of the enabling factors here is that Detroit has a lot of land. It's hard to use land. I mean, there are a number of challenges. You can't walk it. It's not like there are a bunch of great turnkey spaces and things like that. But I'm from Boston, and when something new comes in, something old has to go out, right? We're really out of space. And so for the kind of Memphis, Detroit, Cleveland, these places that lost significant, either added land and or lost significant population and jobs, like, you have an opportunity to actually have an inclusive economy within your city, right? You can have land-intensive uses. You can have, a number of, you can do a lot of things, and you don't have to specialize the way that these super tight cities like San Francisco and Boston has to. And this is one of the great opportunities, I think, for inclusion. And it's great to see, like, the way that Detroit has really acted on this.
Great. So I'm sorry we went a little bit over because we started so late, but lunch will be now served at 12:45 in the ballroom. Thank you so much for being here.